Rowan Hayes was only 19 when everything she knew was buried under 10 feet of snow. A single avalanche took her parents, her childhood home nestled in the Colorado Rockies, and every dream she'd carefully sketched in the margins of her life. All she had left was a brass compass necklace her father gave her, its needle still pointing north, even when her world had lost all direction, and a debt so crushing it would chain her to a man who saw her as nothing more than a business transaction. Rowan's story is one of survival, of being trapped in a gilded cage and discovering that sometimes the coldest hearts hide the warmest souls. It's a journey of innocence, vulnerability, and a love that neither of them saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of a woman forced into a marriage she never wanted, with a man who had no idea that beneath her quiet strength was a heart that had never been touched. Let's begin. Rowan Hayes was 27 years old, but her gray-green eyes carried the weight of someone who'd lived twice that long. Her auburn hair was always pulled into a practical braid, and her hands were perpetually raw from scrubbing floors and folding linens at the Pinecrest Mountain Resort. The resort sat high in the Colorado Rockies, a sprawling luxury lodge that catered to the wealthy elite who came to ski, to escape, to pretend the real world didn't exist. For Rowan, the resort was her prison. She lived in a cramped staff cabin behind the main lodge, its thin walls barely keeping out the bitter mountain cold. Every morning she woke at 4 a.m., her fingers stiff as she dressed in her uniform, her breath fogging in the air. She worked 16-hour shifts under the iron fist of her uncle, Gerald Hayes, who owned the resort and saw her as free labor, a debt to be paid for the roof over her head. Rowan's life hadn't always been this bleak. Once she dreamed of becoming a botanical illustrator, capturing the delicate beauty of alpine wildflowers in watercolor and ink. Her father had encouraged her, buying her sketchbooks and paints, telling her that art was how the soul spoke when words failed. Her mother had framed her drawings, displaying them proudly in their small cabin home. But that was before the avalanche. She was 19 when it happened. A late-season storm had triggered a massive snowslide that buried their cabin in seconds. Her parents never made it out. Rowan had been in town that day, buying art supplies, and she returned to find nothing but a white tomb where her home had stood. The rescue teams recovered their bodies 3 days later. Orphaned and drowning in grief, Rowan had nowhere to turn. Her uncle Gerald reluctantly took her in, but his kindness was a lie wrapped in cruelty. He made her work every day at the resort, paying her barely enough to survive, reminding her constantly that she owed him for his generosity. "You'd be homeless without me," he'd say, his voice cold as the mountain air. "Don't forget that, girl." Gerald's wife Pauline was no better. She watched Rowan with suspicious eyes, treating her like a servant rather than family. They worked her to exhaustion, leaving her no time to paint, no energy to dream. The only thing Rowan kept from her old life was the brass compass necklace, engraved with her father's words, "True north is in your heart." She wore it every day, hidden beneath her uniform, a secret reminder that she'd once been more than this. At night, when the resort finally quieted, Rowan would sit in her cabin with a stolen sketchbook, her fingers aching as she drew alpine forget-me-nots and columbines by candlelight. Those stolen moments were all she had left of herself, fragile and fading like her hope. Rowan had never known love beyond her parents. She'd never been kissed, never been held, never let anyone close enough to see the scars she carried. The isolation of the mountains and the suffocating control of her uncle had kept her sheltered, innocent in ways that made her feel both protected and painfully naive. She was a young woman trapped, her spirit dimmed but not extinguished, clinging to a compass that promised true north even when she'd lost her way. Across the mountain valley, Perched on a cliff overlooking the endless expanse of snow and stone, stood the Ashford estate. It was a modern fortress of steel and glass, its angular architecture cutting into the sky like a blade. Inside lived Damien Ashford, a man whose name was whispered with equal parts admiration and fear throughout Colorado's business circles. At 41, Damien was a venture capitalist who'd built an empire by buying struggling companies, gutting them, and rebuilding them into profitable machines. His investment firm controlled half the resorts in the Rockies, including Pinecrest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his black hair threaded with silver at the temples, his jaw sharp and perpetually set in a hard line. His eyes were a piercing ice blue, the kind that seemed to see through every weakness, every lie. People called him ruthless. They weren't wrong. But what they didn't know was that Damien Ashford was a man haunted by ghosts. 5 years ago, his younger sister, the only family he had left, died in a climbing accident on these very mountains. They'd been ascending together when the rope failed. He'd watched her fall, heard her scream cut short, felt the rope go slack in his hands. The guilt had hollowed him out, turning him into a man who kept everyone at arm's length, who worked 18-hour days to avoid the silence where his sister's laughter used to live. His estate reflected his isolation, cold, pristine, beautiful in a way that felt untouchable. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the mountains, but Damien rarely looked at them anymore. The view was a reminder of what he'd lost. His board of directors had been pressuring him for months. "You need to settle down," they said. "Marry. Show stability. Investors don't trust a lone wolf." Damien ignored them until it became clear his refusal was costing him deals. He needed a wife on paper, nothing more. A solution to a problem. That's when Rowan Hayes came crawling to him with a proposition that made Damien's jaw tighten with disgust. Gerald's resort was drowning in debt. Loans Damien's firm had extended years ago. The man couldn't pay, and foreclosure was imminent. But Gerald had an offer, delivered in a private meeting, that reeked of desperation. "I have a niece," Gerald said, his voice oily with false warmth. "Young, pretty, obedient. Marry her, and we'll consider the debt settled. She'll be whatever you need her to be. A wife for your investors, arm candy for your events. She won't cause trouble." Damien's expression didn't change, but inside, revulsion twisted his gut. Still, he was a pragmatist. He needed a wife. This solved 2 problems at once. He didn't have to love her. He didn't even have to know her. "Fine," he said, his voice flat. "But I wanted understood. This is a contract, nothing more." Gerald grinned like he'd won the lottery. Rowan was summoned to Gerald's office that same evening, her heart hammering as Pauline pushed her through the door. Gerald sat behind his desk, and beside him stood a man Rowan had only seen in business magazines, Damien Ashford, whose cold blue eyes swept over her like she was livestock being appraised. "You're marrying Mr. Ashford," Gerald announced, as if he were telling her to mop a floor. "Tomorrow morning. Pack your things." Rowan's world tilted. "What? No, I can't." "You can and you will," Pauline snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "After everything we've done for you, this is the least you can do. Mr. Ashford has agreed to clear our debts if you marry him. You owe us, Rowan." Rowan's gaze swung to Damien, searching for some sign of humanity, some indication this was a mistake. But his face was carved from stone, his eyes empty of warmth. He looked at her the way someone might look at a piece of furniture, assessing its usefulness, nothing more. "I don't want to marry anyone," Rowan said, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't make me do this." Gerald stood, his bulk intimidating as he loomed over her. "We can and we will. You're 27 years old with nothing to your name. No education, no prospects, no family except us. You'll marry Mr. Ashford, or you'll find yourself on the street in the middle of winter. Your choice." Tears burned Rowan's eyes, but she blinked them back, her hand instinctively reaching for the compass at her throat. Damien's gaze flickered to the movement, then away, uninterested. She had no choice. She never had. The next morning, Rowan stood outside the Ashford estate with a single duffel bag containing everything she owned. The mansion loomed before her like a beautiful, terrible cage. The massive glass doors slid open, and Damien appeared, his presence filling the space. "Come in," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "We have rules to discuss." Rowan stepped inside, and the doors closed behind her with a sound like a prison gate locking shut. Rowan's first weeks in the Ashford estate felt like living in a museum where she wasn't allowed to touch anything. Damien's rules were delivered the moment she arrived. Attend business dinners when required, dress appropriately, smile when necessary, and stay out of his private wing. He spoke to her in clipped sentences, his ice-blue eyes sliding past her as if she were invisible. She had her own suite on the second floor, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. It was 10 times larger than her cabin, filled with expensive furniture she was afraid to sit on. The closet had been stocked with designer clothes she'd never asked for, elegant dresses and heels that felt like costumes for a role she didn't want to play. Every morning, Damien left before dawn for his office downtown. Every evening, he returned late, disappearing into his study without a word. They ate dinner in silence on the rare occasions he was home, the clink of silverware the only sound in the cavernous dining room. Rowan felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. At the business events, she stood beside him in borrowed elegance, her hand resting lightly on his arm as investors and partners congratulated Damien on his marriage. Their curious stares made her skin crawl. She could see the questions in their eyes. Who is she? Where did she come from? What does he see in her? Damien never answered those questions. He introduced her simply as "my wife" and moved on, his hand on her lower back, cold and impersonal. Rowan played her part, smiling until her face ached, feeling more alone than she ever had in Gerald's cabin. But late at night, when the estate fell silent and the mountains glowed silver under the moon, Rowan would slip into the conservatory, a glass-walled room Damien never used. She'd found her old sketchbook in her duffel bag and began drawing again, her fingers tracing the delicate petals of the orchids and ferns that filled the space. Those stolen hours were the only time she felt like herself. The first crack in Damien's armor came unexpectedly. Rowan was arranging flowers for an investor dinner, her hands clumsy with nerves, when she knocked over an antique vase. It shattered across the marble floor, shards glittering like accusations. Her heart stopped. She'd heard stories of Damien's temper, how he'd destroyed competitors with a single phone call, how nothing escaped his icy judgment. She braced herself, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the storm. Instead, she heard his footsteps, slow and measured. Damien knelt beside her, his large hands carefully gathering the broken pieces. When she dared to look at him, his expression wasn't angry. It was almost gentle. "It's just glass," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual edge. "These things break. Don't let it haunt you." Rowan stammered an apology, but Damien shook his head, his ice-blue eyes meeting hers for the first time in weeks. "You're wound so tight you're going to snap," he said. "Stop treating this place like a minefield. You live here now." She didn't know what to say. He stood, disposing of the shards, and that was the end of it. But the moment lingered in her mind, a flicker of something beneath his cold exterior. Over the following weeks, small gestures appeared like breadcrumbs. She found art supplies waiting in the conservatory, professional-grade watercolors, brushes, Bic paper. No note, no explanation. When she worked late into the night painting alpine flowers, she'd discover fresh coffee on the table beside her, still warm, though she never heard Damien enter. One evening, she caught him standing in the conservatory doorway, watching her paint a delicate sketch of mountain bluebells. She froze, her brush hovering over the page, certain he'd order her out of his space. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her work. "My sister used to paint," he said, his voice rough as if the words hurt to speak. "She loved wildflowers, said they were proof that beauty could survive anywhere, even in harsh conditions." Rowan's breath caught. This was the first time he'd mentioned anything personal. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Lily." His jaw tightened. "She died on these mountains 5 years ago. Climbing accident. I was with her when it happened." The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. Rowan set down her brush, her heart aching for him. "I'm so sorry. I lost my parents in an avalanche. I know what it's like to carry that weight." Damien's eyes met hers, and for a moment something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, shared grief. He nodded once, then left without another word, but the air felt different after that. Less cold, less empty. The shift between them was subtle but undeniable. Damien began joining Rowan in the conservatory some evenings, sitting in silence while she painted, occasionally asking about the flowers she illustrated. He told her more about Lily, how she dragged him on hikes, how her laughter had filled the spaces his work left empty. Rowan shared memories of her parents, her father's compass lessons, her mother's encouragement of her art. They weren't friends, they weren't lovers, but they weren't strangers anymore either. Then Gerald and Pauline arrived unannounced on a frigid February afternoon, their desperation thick as the snow falling outside. Rowan was in the conservatory when she heard their voices echoing through the estate, sharp and demanding. Her stomach dropped. She clutched the compass at her throat, her hands trembling. Gerald's face was red with anger when she entered the sitting room. Pauline stood beside him, her expression venomous. Damien was already there, his posture rigid, his ice-blue eyes cold as the mountains. "The resort's failing again," Gerald spat, pointing a finger at Rowan. "You need to come back. Work for us. This marriage was supposed to solve our problems, but you're living in luxury while we're drowning. You owe us, girl." Pauline stepped forward, her voice dripping with malice. "We know things about your precious parents, Rowan. Debts they never settled, secrets that would destroy their memory. Come back and help us, where everyone will know what kind of people raised you." Rowan's knees nearly buckled. The threat to her parents' names, the only good thing left from her past, felt like a knife twisting in her chest. "I don't have money," she said, her voice breaking. "This marriage isn't what you think." He moved to stand between Rowan and her uncle, his presence a wall of controlled fury. Gerald started to argue, but Damien's expression silenced him. "Your debt was cleared 3 weeks ago," Damien said, his voice deadly calm. "Every cent. I have the documentation. You have no claim on her, no leverage, no power here." Gerald's face went white. Pauline sputtered, but Damien continued, each word deliberate. "And if I ever hear you've spread lies about her family, I will personally destroy you. I'll buy every property you've ever touched and burn your reputation to ash. Do you understand me?" They understood. They left without another word, their footsteps echoing their defeat. Rowan stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Damien turned to her, and for the first time since their wedding day, his expression was completely open. No walls, no coldness, just raw concern. "You're free, Rowan," he said quietly. "The debt's gone. You don't owe them anything. You don't owe me anything either. If you want to leave, I'll arrange it. No strings. You can start over wherever you want." The words should have brought relief, but instead they shattered something in her chest. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Damien's jaw worked, his hands flexing at his sides. "Because you deserve to choose your own life. I forced you into this. That was wrong." Rowan's mind reeled, but before she could respond, her eyes caught something on the side table, an envelope with her name in Damien's sharp handwriting. Her hands shook as she picked it up. Inside was a deed, legal documents, and photographs. Damien had purchased the land where her parents' cabin had been buried. On that land, he'd built a botanical conservatory, a stunning glass structure filled with alpine wildflowers, with studio space for painting and illustration. The documents showed it was registered in her parents' names, the Hayes Memorial Conservatory. I broke ground 2 months ago. It'll be finished in spring. It's yours, Rowan, whether you stay here or not. I thought you should have a place where your art and their memory could live together. Rowan's tears fell onto the photographs, blurring the images of columbines and forget-me-nots growing in careful rows. He'd done this, not for show, not for control, but for her, for them. I'm staying, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. Not because I'm trapped, because I choose you. Damien's breath caught. Rowan, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she interrupted, stepping closer. That's why I'm choosing to. You gave me my freedom, Damien. You gave me my parents back. You saw me when no one else did. His ice blue eyes searched hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. I don't deserve you, he said hoarsely. Maybe not, she said, a small smile breaking through her tears. But you have me anyway. Damien's hand reached up slowly, his fingers brushing her cheek, catching her tears. I need you to understand something, he said quietly. This marriage, if we're doing this, I want it to be real. Not a contract. Real.
Rowan's heart hammered. She'd never been close to anyone like this, never felt desire or intimacy beyond her innocent dreams. The vulnerability in his eyes matched her own fear and hope. She started, her cheeks flushing. I've never been with anyone. I don't know how to. Damien's expression softened completely, understanding dawning in his eyes. We'll figure it out together, he said gently. No rush, no expectations, just us. Their foreheads touched, and Rowan felt truly seen for the first time in her life. 4 years had passed since Rowan Hayes chose to stay with Damien Ashford, and the woman who now stood in the Hayes Memorial Conservatory barely resembled the frightened girl who'd arrived at his estate with a single duffel bag. Spring had transformed the Colorado mountains into a tapestry of wildflowers, and the glass conservatory Damien built gleamed like a jewel against the pine forests. Rowan moved through the space with quiet confidence, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her gray-green eyes bright with purpose. The conservatory had become her sanctuary and her legacy. Rows of alpine forget-me-nots, columbines, and bluebells grew in carefully tended beds, each species labeled with botanical precision. Her watercolor illustrations lined the walls, stunning, detailed paintings that caught the attention of botanical journals and nature magazines across the country. Her first book, Wildflowers of the Rockies, An Illustrated Journey, sat on the display table near the entrance, its cover featuring her painting of the exact flowers that grew where her parents' cabin once stood. The book had become a bestseller, beloved by botanists and artists alike. Rowan had done more than survive. She'd thrived, her art finally finding the audience her father always believed it deserved. But the conservatory was more than her workspace. Twice a week, local children gathered for free art classes, their laughter echoing off the glass walls as Rowan taught them to see the beauty in tiny petals and delicate stems. She'd started a scholarship program for young artists from struggling families, ensuring that lack of money would never bury someone's dreams the way it almost buried hers. The town had embraced her, not as Damien Ashford's wife, but as Rowan Hayes, the artist who'd brought beauty and opportunity to their mountain community. Gerald and Pauline's resort had closed 2 years ago, foreclosed and sold to a hotel chain that gutted it completely. Gerald had tried to contact Damien once, begging for another loan, another chance. Damien's response had been a single word: no. They'd moved to Arizona, their reputation in Colorado destroyed, their names spoken only as cautionary tales about greed and cruelty. Rowan felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet relief that their shadows no longer touched her life. On this particular spring evening, Rowan stood at the conservatory's entrance, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, 6 months along with their first child. The baby kicked and she smiled, placing both hands over the movement. Damien's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hands covering hers. "Busy in there today?" he asked, his voice warm with affection that would have seemed impossible 4 years ago. "Very busy," Rowan said, leaning back against his chest. "Takes after you, already demanding attention."
Damien chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. The cold, isolated billionaire had melted away year by year, replaced by a man who laughed easily, who spoke openly about his feelings, who'd learned to let people close again. Rowan had done that, and he'd given her the freedom to become herself. "Your editor called," Damien said. "They want to discuss your next book, something about medicinal plants of the high country." Rowan nodded, excitement bubbling up. "I've been researching for months. There's so much traditional knowledge being lost. I want to preserve it, illustrate it, make it accessible." "You will," Damien said with absolute certainty. "You always do." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the mountains turn purple with dusk. Rowan's fingers found the brass compass at her throat. She still wore it every day. Its familiar weight, a connection to the parents who'd believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. "True north is in your heart," she whispered, reading the engraving she knew by memory. Damien turned her gently to face him, his ice-blue eyes now warm as summer sky. "You found it," he said softly. "Your true north, your art, your purpose, your home." Rowan smiled, tears of joy pricking her eyes. "I found more than that," she said, her hand cupping his cheek. "I found you. I found us." He kissed her then, tender and deep, the kind of kiss that still made her heart race even after 4 years of learning to love him, learning to trust the intimacy they'd built together, slowly, carefully, beautifully. When they pulled apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his hands splayed protectively over their child. "From contract to forever. Best decision I never planned to make." Rowan laughed, the sound echoing through the conservatory like music. "Best prison I ever walked into." As darkness settled over the mountains and lights twinkled on in the conservatory, illuminating the flowers and paintings that represented Rowan's journey from ashes to triumph, she realized something profound. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the hardest places. Sometimes forced paths lead to chosen destinations, and sometimes love finds you in the coldest moments, warming everything it touches. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.